Good morning, afternoon, and evening, CSS Nation. This is Harry Mullen and my co-host Pernell Husband. How you doing, Pernell?
I'm doing good, Harry. How are you this morning?
As I always say, excellent.
Excellent indeed. What's on tap for
So,
today, Harry?
well, let's see. I happened to get an email from a company that brought up an interesting question. And so, first let me start by saying that we've had to deal with exposures in this past year, specifically talking about COVID and the pandemic. But have we been solely thinking about that, or are we actually thinking about the safety of ourselves working in sterile processing to other types of exposures? So that's
Yeah,
my question.
particularly for those of us that work in sterile processing day in and day out, we're not thinking about the chemicals that we may be exposed to, trace chemicals that may be in our environment. And the question is, could we or are we being harmed by these chemicals? Most of us, most of you probably never think about that, but it is an issue that we did want to talk about. That is exposure to harmful chemicals in our environment. There are even a couple of companies, like Harry mentioned, out there who are providing services and products to test the environment in sterile processing. You want to talk a little bit more about the issues surrounding peracetic acid?
Right. So that was specifically the email that I had received from a vendor that was talking about a study to exposures to parasitic acid, and that the possibility of it causing such conditions like asthma in
Mhm.
through occupational exposures and stuff. And so I clicked on the study that they were talking about, and it brought me to the website to Oxford Academic, and
Mhm.
talking about occupational asthma caused by parasitic acid and hydrogen peroxide mixtures
Mhm.
and stuff. Now, again, we're bringing up this question as a possibility because in the article, and let's preface by saying that this article was released back in June of 2019. So we're talking, we're coming up on 2 years. And
Mhm.
in the study, it only talked about one case report with an individual who had been exposed and developed symptoms and such. And so, we're not trying to set out the alarm for everybody to say, hey, this is a massive issue, but it just brings to mind that sterile processing technicians, managers, anybody coming into the sterile processing department are potentially exposed to numerous chemicals that may eventually cause, occupational injury to you. I mean, we done away for the most part in most facilities throughout the United States with ethylene oxide, because we know that that was the bad boy for many years, um, known to cause cancer and birth defects in pregnant women. And so we thought we'd talk about this in general as an overview, not necessarily specific to parasitic acid, but just all the chemicals that are there.
Absolutely, Harry. And so we kind of come across this issue, like Harry mentioned, every once in a while. We have clients that will reach out and ask about, hey, what is this with um, exposures to chemicals in the sterile processing area? Is there anything to it? Well, some people will say that the jury is still out, And some people would say that they're convinced that many hospitals are exceeding the limits, the exposure limits for these chemicals. And there could be, some people would argue, potential harm being done to people working in these environments. Again, we're not suggesting that there is. There's a lot of discussion happening. There's a lot of companies looking into these concerns. Harry and I have talked about having people on who are experts in this area to get us up to speed on these issues. So we definitely believe that there should be a strategy. Departments should have a strategy to determine if staff is being exposed to harmful chemicals. Again, we're not experts, but we will be talking to experts who will hopefully bring us up to speed on these very important questions.
Well, Pernell, I think it's very important to understand for people to clue into the fact that, we have the government agencies who have set permissible exposure limits. And I don't know that all the technicians out there necessarily know what the permissible exposure limits are in an 8-hour work day or in a 40-hour work week. And so, just to go over some of the numbers, ethylene oxide, which was, again, the bad boy of all the chemicals and was gotten rid of in departments, the permissible exposure limit is 1 part per million in an 8-hour period. Lo and behold, come to find out that companies that have the hydrogen peroxide sterilization for low temperature sterilization that replaced essentially ETO also has the same 1 part per million in an 8-hour period permissible exposure limit. And why is it that it's okay to get rid of ETO out of the workplace with 1 part per million, but hydrogen peroxide is safe when it is also 1 part per million? And then you and I this morning were looking at the numbers and come to find out that the permissible exposure limit to the parasitic acid is actually 0.2 parts per million, if I remember correctly, in an 8-hour period. So that means it's even much lower. The threshold is much lower. And, so it brings to mind, what is the responsibility of the employer in order to protect its employees from these occupational exposures? As well as the manufacture of these chemicals. I mean, I know we discussed, we have monitoring devices from, I'll just name a few. I know that 3M has monitoring devices. You have ChemDAC that has monitoring devices, and I'm sure there's many more companies out there that also provide products for hospitals to be able to use. But in my 33 years, I don't know, you tell me, Pernell, how many places have you actually gone to where you actually see the staff are actually wearing the personal monitoring device that's supposed to be within 12 inches from the breathing zone?
Yeah, I mean, not too many. I have had some experiences where I've worked with ETO sterilizers and ETO sterilization back in the day, and we definitely wore the devices, and there were alarms and visual cues that would let you know if there was some sort of a leak. I think this may be a new issue to some folks. To some people, this may be their first time hearing about potential exposure to hazardous chemicals. I mean, these chemicals that we employ on a daily basis to sterilize or to kill microorganisms are harmful. And we need for them to be harmful to the microorganisms. So, as you mentioned, I think companies definitely have a responsibility to ensure that they're marketing products that are not harmful to the people who are going to be working with them on a regular basis. And also, hospitals or institutions have to have some responsibility for ensuring that the chemicals that are in use are being used appropriately and are not affecting people in a negative way.
Exactly. Well, recapping what you just said, Pernell, the fact that these chemicals that we're using are killing these microbes in order to make it safe for use on patients. But it goes back, to a question that I was thinking, but it wasn't actually brought up is our environment killing us or minimally at least causing harm in some fashion? Maybe not going to the extent of actually killing us, but at least, as in the article, causing asthma. And, and that's no joke. I've had family members that have respiratory diseases, such as asthma. And, people say, oh, you can't breathe. Well, calm down. And well, asthma can kill.
Yeah.
All right. Not to mention, if it can cause asthma, these chemicals could potentially cause cancer, then eventually can kill you. So,
well, remember,
I just think it's something to think about.
Harry, you and I are old enough to remember a time when asbestos was perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Where asbestos was used in the construction of ships, houses, insulation, roofing materials. There was a time when smoking cigarettes was completely acceptable, and some argued that they were even safe and healthy.
Well,
so things
recommended
change
by your doctor as some, to calm the nerves back in the early 1900s. It was recommended.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, things change, knowledge, research, and we learn. So, what we're trying to convey to our audience is if you're not aware of this particular issue, you should be. The sterile processing environment should not have trace gases in amounts that could potentially harm people working in those environments. And so you need to be aware that this may be an issue and start having conversations around your environment and the safety of that environment vis-a-vis these chemicals that we work with on a regular basis. Again, we're not saying we have all of the answers. We're saying start asking questions, start having conversations about the safety and your exposure to these chemicals that you work with day in and day out.
Absolutely. And let me just, let's pause for just a moment, Pernell, and go to our news segment with Cylindra Bearfield, news you can use. So we'll be right back.
Welcome to the news with Ion Sterile Processing. This is Cylindra Bearfield. This news is brought to you by Focus on This. As the world reopens, it's normal to feel overwhelmed and unmotivated. Adam Grant recently penned an article for the New York Times on the lack of focus and motivation brought on by the pandemic. He defined this blah feeling as languishing. Near the end of the article, Adam shares the most important factors in daily joy and motivation and a sense of progress. If you're feeling more than motivated, here's a simple strategy you can apply right now. Set your daily big three. The daily big three eliminates burnout and accelerate progress by narrowing your to-do list to only 3 items. It gives you a plan for your day and forces you to focus on the high leverage work. This daily exercise gives you permission to focus on your priorities instead of being tossed around by others' needs. By the end of the day, you'll be able to check 3 important tasks off your list. Know what that's called? Progress. Joy is on the way. This is brought to you by Full Focus Team, and this is Ion Sterile Processing. My name is Cylindra Bearfield, and you continue to go out there and be great. Thank you.
Well, folks, welcome back to the show, and I want to thank Cylindra for that tidbit of news that she was able to give to us. So, Pernell, in the first segment of the show, we talked about the permissible exposure limits and some of the hazards and stuff. So why don't we go ahead and recap and then expand upon some of the potential hazards and stuff. So I know we had the ChemDAC website, and I'm going to go ahead and bring that up on our screen. There we go. And so go ahead and recap as far as the exposure limits and potential hazards or risks that can be associated with these chemicals.
Absolutely. So ChemDAC Incorporated is actually one of the companies in this space, environmental monitoring and consulting services regarding potential exposure from harmful chemicals in sterile processing areas. So we'll just look a little bit here, hazards and risks for chemicals in your workplace. We all know that biocides are designed to kill all forms of life. Due to their toxicity toward biological organisms, which we are biological organisms, they can be hazardous to human and health, and careful use is required. OSHA and the National Institute for Occupational Safety, blah, 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 NIOSH, the American Conference of Government Industrial Hygienists, have issued recommended or regulatory exposure limits for biocides. When working with biocides, it is important to monitor your surroundings to ensure the chemical vapors are at a safe level. And they talk a little bit about, some of the products that they have and what they do. But I want to come down here, like Harry mentioned, and look at some of the PELs, or permissible exposure limits, for the different chemicals. And as you can see here, ethylene oxide is 1 part per million. Hydrogen peroxide is 1 part per million, and peracetic acid is 0.2 parts per million. And it says that this is pending in Cal OSHA, that is California's OSHA.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, and remember, the parts per million, that is not over a 40-hour work week. These exposure limits are over an 8-hour work shift. So, right. And that's a lot. 1 part per million. You wouldn't think it's 1 part per a million parts is a lot, but I mean, it just shows you that 1 part per million can have detrimental effects with you when regards to ethylene oxide and hydrogen peroxide. But what really stands out to me is the peracetic acid at 0.2 parts per million. And again, that is still pending, per cal OSHA, but still the fact that they're even looking at it, 0.2 parts per million is not a lot. And so, what are we doing? I know they say wear personal protective equipment, but I remember as a technician, personal protective equipment meant wearing maybe a face shield so that I didn't get splashed, or wearing gloves, but it had nothing to do with maybe perhaps wearing a respirator. And in my, again, 33 years in sterile processing, 20 of them as a technician, not once did I ever wear a personal monitoring device. So, it's to me, it's scary. I think it's something that's to be noted, and to be that our technicians out there in CSS Nation definitely need to be cognizant about it, and bring this concern up to their employers.
Well, yeah, it's definitely gathering as much information as you can, and like Harry and I mentioned, we're in touch with some experts in the field that would like to get on to discuss this issue from a technical point of view, so that you guys can have as much information as you need. Now, again, this is all according to the ChemDAC website. So down here, health dangers to peracetic acid, hydrogen peroxide, and ethylene oxide, which most sterile processing departments work with, again, on a regular basis.
At least two out of the three. Yeah,
absolutely. Pulmonary edema is an issue with all three of the chemicals. Permanent lung damage, according to ChemDAC, it can be caused by peracetic acid and ethylene oxide.
And let me interject here. Let me tell you something about hydrogen peroxide. Just regular hydrogen peroxide that we use at home. A lot of people use it as a disinfectant when they have a cut. And over the years, I have known the fact that hydrogen peroxide does damage. And it is actually not recommended that when you have a cut that you wash the wound with hydrogen peroxide, because it'll actually cause scarring. It damages, the foaming action is basically kind of like an acid, destroying blood, the blood particles as well as tissue. And so just think about what it can do to a cut and the foaming, and the fact that it causes scarring. What is that doing to your lungs if you're breathing in potentially vaporized hydrogen peroxide? I think the fact that it's not checked off is only indicative of the fact that there's not enough studies. So to me, I would say that would still be a concern, potential lung damage. And again, we're not experts in this. We're not trying to say that this is exactly what it's going to do, but I just know that the damage it can do to your regular tissue, what can it do to your lungs?
Well, we know skin burns, peracetic acid, hydrogen peroxide. Anybody that's handled a canceled load in a STERRAD unit without gloves can testify to the fact that some kind of burning is happening there. So skin burns, obviously an issue with ethylene oxide as well. Skin and hair bleaching. Well, hydrogen peroxide definitely bleaches hair and skin. I've seen that. And mutagen. Maybe I should have looked that up before. Not quite sure what that is, but it is an issue with hydrogen peroxide and ethylene oxide. It says here that ethylene oxide is a carcinogen, causes cancer, which we know, which is one of the reasons it's not in wide use anymore, ethylene oxide.
Right. And real quick, so the mutagen or mutagen or however you'd like to pronounce that. Did a quick look up on the internet, and that is an agent such as radiation or a chemical
Mm.
substance which causes genetic mutation.
Well, that's
That's
not
a good
good.
word. This I think is the first time I've ever seen that word myself.
Yeah,
So
that
we're always learning.
kind of gives new meaning to X-Men, right? Get it? Get the
Yeah.
connection? Maybe you might look up teratogen as well.
Teratogen. So
Teratogen.
carcinogen, cancer causing, teratogen, which means it causes birth defects in fetuses.
Mm, okay. And that's ethylene oxide. Affects male and female reproductive systems, higher risk for miscarriage.
Yeah.
And ethylene oxide has that distinction. And as you can see, ethylene oxide has the most check marks. And we kind of
Right.
know that ethylene oxide has a long history of causing medical issues, birth defects, and that sort of thing. So, again, we're bringing this issue up not to scare anyone, but to just sort of suggest having some conversations about this particular issue.
Right.
Um,
Having an
with
awareness.
absolutely, um, and being aware of these potential dangers that are out there. Again, as we've said, we're in contact with some folks that we'd like to bring on to discuss this issue more
Mm-hmm.
in depth.
Well,
Because
you know what?
all of you,
Let me go ahead and put it out, send out an invitation to both a representative from 3M and ChemDAC to come on to the show. Because if I'm not mistaken, at least I know for a fact ChemDAC has the monitoring devices. I do believe that 3M also has monitoring devices, and I would say that they're more of an expert in this field since they have the products that are meant to safeguard the protection of our employees and stuff. And one other thing I wanted to mention in that checkoff list, I noticed that even though hydrogen peroxide, again, it didn't say anything about damage to lungs, but it did say that it did do damage to mucous membranes as well as skin burns. And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the lungs a type of mucous membrane? So it's like it's funny how it didn't have it checked off in one area, but it did have something checked off. And I know most people are saying, Harry, your mucous membranes are talking mostly about, let's say, surrounding the inside of the nose or inside your mouth and stuff. So
yeah, no, I think that's a valid point, and definitely a question that we will ask of you know the experts once we get them on the show. We think that you should be aware. This isn't a new issue by any means, but this is a
no,
new
it's
show.
not. Yeah.
So we think our audience should be, as well informed as anyone out there on these potential dangers.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, going back to the vendor that I got the email from, it was actually ChemDAC that I received the email from just in the last day or two that cited the study that was done back in June of 2019. So
Mhm.
apparently they felt it was important enough to send out information. And and they are offering services to come in to help monitor the situation in the department, and which brings up which is a type of consulting, and so brings up to the question about consulting, and that's something that we do as well. Correct, Pernell?
Absolutely. If you have concerns or in your department as it relates to best practices, as it relates to preparing for survey, as it relates to education and training, we are your solution for that. Central Sterilization Solutions is not only a training school for sterile processing technicians, but we provide expert consulting services in the sterile processing space. And right here, we're going to insert for the very first time the commercial that I shot about consulting. We provide consulting services in the central services arena. We can help with departmental assessments, survey readiness, education and training, project management, and we also offer some interim management solutions. Central Sterilization Solutions has been in operations now for 11 years. We also bring a combined experience of 40 years to the sterile processing arena. We believe that we are uniquely qualified and equipped because of our lengthy experience and our expertise in the field. We believe that we can be an integral part of your department's transformation. You can reach us on the World Wide Web at centralsterilizationsolutions.com.
Well, there you go, folks. That was an outstanding commercial by my co-host, Pernell Husband.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Pernell, any final words?
Yeah, Harry, we'll be back.